Good morning, everyone. So today we are going to start with the next topic of the class 10th of biology, that is the flower, which is what we are going to look at right now. So yes, so now what do you see in front of you? There are different type of flowers. Yes, they are colorful, they are bright, and we can see like they are having different structures as well. Like they are of different forms. Aesthetically, they are of great value, right? Can use them for decoration and other purposes. Yes. And now, have you ever observed any flower carefully that what different structures are present in a single flower? If no, then you should begin doing it because there are many different type of ways in which different structures of the flower are being depicted in nature. Yes, because there we have two different type of flowers, but we can see the difference they are having, right? In one there is the purple thing in the center, and in the second there is this green thing in the center, and it is of different form than the first one, right? And in here the this part that is darker, it is also different from the this part of the other flower that is lighter in appearance. So we can say there is variation in these flowers, the structural variation we can see. Yes, so now what we are going to discuss about today is the flower as a sexual structure basically. That is, the flower may be unisexual or bisexual. So when we say unisexual, as the name suggests, uni means one. Yes, I know you must be knowing this earlier as well from your previous classes. You must have somewhere discussed it with your teacher. So a flower that is unisexual is something that is having a flower that is having only one part. Here the part we are talking about is the sexual part. Either it will be the female part or the male part. So the flower, unisexual flower, will be having one type of sexual structure in it. Either it will be a female sexual structure in that unisexual flower or a male sexual structure in that unisexual flower. So when it contains either stamens or pistil. Here stamens are the male reproductive part of the flower, and the pistil is comprising of the female reproductive part of the plant. And the flower may be bisexual as well. Here bisexual. Now, as we have seen that in unisexual, we are saying that there will be only one sexual structure that is present, that will be going to be present in the flower. But in case of bisexual, both the sexual structures will be there, will be present in the flower. That is, the stamens as well as the pistil, both will be there. The flowers are used by plants for sexual reproduction. So instead of just being like aesthetic, just giving the aesthetic value to the flower or to the plant, basically, flowers are also used by the plant for sexual reproduction. But we can say that basically it is the most important purpose that a flower is having to be on the plant. In fact, every single part of a flower is used only for reproduction. So when we say that they are of recreational value, they are having great aesthetics, but the main purpose of the flower is to reproduce, and every part of the flower is going to contribute towards that process of reproduction. What we are saying, right? Their only reason for living is to grow, reproduce, and then die. So for the flower to exist on a plant, the reason is only just to reproduce and then die. They will be growing when when the plant knows that it's time to reproduce. They will be growing flowers. We must have also observed that in different seasons, different plants are producing different type of flowers. So they know that when the season is there, they are going to like grow and grow flowers, and these flowers are going to reproduce, and then they will be shedding or they will be dying, because we know a flower also wilts and it dies simply. So you will be bringing a flower to compare the reproductive structures. That will be very helpful to know the structure of a flower basically. So here when we look at this structure, we can see that here these four structures, they are having divided into two parts. This whole structure, the knob like part is the anther, while this stalk like structure, it has been called as filament, and they are collectively forming the stamens. What are they collectively forming? They are forming the stamen, and the stamen is what we are calling it as the male part of the flower, right? And when if we look at this middle part of the flower, this thing, then this structure is the stigma. And the long tube-like structure, we can say stalk-like structure, we are calling it as the style. I hope you are able to see it clearly. Otherwise also, I am speaking it alongside, so you will be able to understand well. And this pipe-like structure is, we are calling it as style. While when we look at the base, there will be a ovule, we can say. We'll be discussing about this structure of that ovule in the upcoming classes. You may refer to that later on. So this ovule will be there, and this whole structure, this whole middle structure from this knob, like bulb like structure towards this stigma, it is being called as pistil. That is the female part of the flower, right? And this receptacle, this is the like the base for the ovary to stay, or the pistil to stand, right? And then these petals, how will they be contributing towards the reproduction? They are acting as a attractant for the pollinators, basically, which we'll be discussing on again, like later on. So they will also be contributing towards the reproduction. And these sepals, this green part that is slightly rough than the petals, basically, they will be also contributing towards the reproduction, because they are protecting the petals when the flower is small and forming a bud like structure, right? So this is also a pedicel from which this flower will be connected to the plant, so we are calling it as pedicel. So now I hope that all the structure of the flower, the different structures that are present in the flower, these structures are clear to you. So we'll be moving forward from here. Yes. Now we have a thinking point for you. How are flowers contributing towards the continuation of plant species or not? I'll be giving you a few seconds to think upon it, and you will be like giving your answers in the chat box, so that I will be knowing that if you have understood the previous concept as well. Yes. Yes. Okay, so flowers are just like you must have heard about reproduction in case of humans as well, or just in general, what reproduction does. There will be duplication, there will be, or we can say there will be increasing number of individuals of a generation, of a population, because of the reproduct process of reproduction. So in similar way in plants as well, they reproduce, or we can say they increase in number with this process of reproduction. And for reproduction, flower is the compulsion, or we can say flower, having a flower is mandatory for reproduction to happen, because for basically for sexual reproduction, for, and if you talk about sexual reproduction will give us variety, and it will be introducing variations in the new generation. For reproduction, for producing, for increasing in number, asexual reproduction is also there. So we can say they will be increasing in number, but through flower, how flower is contributing, flower is introducing variation as well. So if there is variation, it will give us the adaptations which are required to sustain in a particular environment, or we can say the changing environment. Just like the reproduction, sexual reproduction is happening, it is bringing changes into the humans that are coming into the next generation, and they are then now adapted to the certain environmental conditions which earlier individuals were not, or we can say earlier animals were not. So we can say it is this sexual reproduction is giving us the adaptations, or we can say the variations which will help us to adapt to the new or changing environment. In the same way, flower is the like main unit that is involved in the sexual reproduction when it comes to plants. So it will also bring variations, and it will also be contributing towards the sustainability, or we can say the like the adaptability of the any individual, any like plant species in that environment that which the in which the plant is particularly living in at present. So this is how the flowers are contributing towards a continuation of plant species or not, because it will be help the plant to adapt to the changing environment, and the continuation of generation will also be there. I hope this is clear to you. So we'll be moving forward from here. Yes, now you will be labeling this following diagram. You will be you will be trying to draw this diagram in your notebooks as well. You will try to label it. So you can also like mark the answers, and just give your responses in the chat box, so that I'll be able to know if you know the different parts of the flower now. I'll give you a few seconds to look upon the diagram. You will be answering that what red part depicts and what this green central part depicts. What is this, like, this knob-like structure that is present at in four in number, that is four in number, and is attached to a stalk. What is it being called? Yes, by the time you answer, we'll be moving forward. I'll check your responses later on. Yes. Now, this is also one question which you need to answer. That is, the male reproductive part of a flower, the stamens, are collectively known as androecium. True or false? Yes. The male reproductive part of a flower, the stamens, are collectively known as androecium. True or false? I'll be checking your responses in the chat box. So we will be moving forward from here. Yes. Now, students, are you able to see anything on the screen? Like, between these mountains, can you see the powdery substance that is flying through? Yes, because there is this structure, or we can say this whole part in the picture is depicting something that is related to the plants and the structure that we have discussed just now. So we'll be discussing what it is. Yes, so this whole structure that we see in here, this is nothing but a pollen grain that is released from the anther of a flower. So an anther is the male reproductive part of the flower. So this male reproductive part is roaming around in the air and in search of the stigma that where it should belong to. So it will be landing on there. So if we talk about pollen grains, each pollen grain is a minute body of varying shape and size. So each pollen grain is what it is. It is a minute body. Minute means tiny body of structure of varying shape and size. They will vary in shape and they may vary in size as well. I'll just move myself here so that you'll be able to look at this. But yes. So shape and size, yes, formed in the male structure of flower bearing plants and transported by various means to the female structures. Yes. Now, if we talk about pollen grains, they are minute and they'll vary in size and shape. They are formed in the female structure of the flower bearing plants. So, flower bearing plants are basically angiosperms, we call them. So, they will be present in that male part. Anthers will be there, and these pollen grains will be attached to those anthers. Then upon maturation, when they mature, they will be being attached to those anthers. But when they will reach maturation, they will be pollen dehiscence, that they will become detached from the anthers and they will be flying through the air, or basically any mode of transfer they will be following, they will be doing that, because different plant species undergo different uh, mechanisms of transfer from the anther to the stigma of the other flower or the same flower. They will be following different mechanisms. So on the basis of the mechanism that species follows, they will be following that after dehiscence. Dehiscence basically means the detachment of the pollen from the anther or from the plant body it was attached. Yes. So transported by various means to the female structures where fertilization occurred. And the fertilization will occur in the female structure. In angiosperms, if we talk about, pollen is produced by the anthers of the stamen in flowers. So just like I just told you that pollen is produced by the anthers of the stamens in flower. Anther is the male productive part of the plant of the flower. So therein pollens will be produced and they will be dehisced when it is time or when they are mature. So if we talk about the structure of this pollen, we can see, like, yes, there is this generative cell, or we can say it is having a generative nucleus as well. Then there is this vegetative cell as well. Then there are two layers that are present in the pollen. One is entine and the inner layer is present, that is entine, and the outer layer is exine. And if we talk about any aperture, then we have this germ pore that is coming out from the entine. It is interrupting the entire exine layer and it is forming in the a pore in the exine layer that is being called as germ pore. If you talk about the functions, then this generative cell will be going to this generative nucleus is the nucleus that is going to divide with the female nuclei when it enters the ovule or the female reproductive part of the flower. So this keeping aside, it will be fusing with the female nuclei. So we'll be keeping it aside. If we talk about generate, we can just relate it with the word create or produce. So it will be responsible for the production of the new plant or new structure that will be formed after the fertilization, that is zygote. So it will be fusing with the female nuclei. And if we talk about this vegetative nucleus, we can relate it with how, when as humans also, our mothers used to say that you will be not be growing enough, you will be not be growing to your max if you won't eat vegetables. So we can connect it with those vegetables, because a vegetative nucleus will also help this generative nucleus, or we can say this whole structure, because we know that pollen will be undergoing germination to enter the stigma later on. When this pollen will reach to the stigma of the flower or female part, so we can say there this pollen has to germinate. For that germination, pollen tube formation is required, and for the growth and development of that pollen tube to reach towards the ovule or the female part of the plant or the flower, this vegetative nucleus is necessary, because it will be providing the growth that is required at that time. So it will help in the germination of pollen tube at the time of pollen germination. So we know that now this is helpful in growth and nutrition at the time of pollen tube formation. And where the pollen tube will be formed, if there will be layer of like this spore pollen layer that is present at the outermost side of the pollen. So this is a rough layer which protects the pollen from the outside rough environment. A rough layer is present to protect the pollen from it. So if it is this much protected, then how will the pollen tube will extend from the pollen? Through this germ pore, the pollen tube will be extending, and the layer that is responsible for pollen tube extension, that is intine. So the function of this intine layer is for the pollen tube formation. It will be extending from this pore that is being called as the germ pore. So I hope now this structure of pollen is clear to you all. So we should move forward from here. Yes, we have just discussed this. So what benefits would you think the two layers, exine and intine, provide to the pollen grains? So what according to you are the benefits that the exine and intine layers are providing to the pollen grains? I'll be giving you few seconds to answer this question, as we have just discussed this. You can put your answers in the chat box so that you will be knowing if you know the answer or not. I'll be checking that later on. Yes. So the exine and antine, if we talk about, we have just discussed that exine is the protective layer that is present in outside the pollen to protect it from the harsh and rough environment that is outside. And antine is basically the layer that is responsible for the pollen tube formation when it is required for the by the pollen, because pollen needs to germinate when it reaches to the towards the stigma of the desired flower, or we can say the flower with where it is supposed to germinate. The pollen needs to germinate through the help of pollen tube that will be reaching towards the ovule. So for that, entire layer is required, that is the inner layer out of the two layers. Yes, so I hope this is clear to you now. So we'll be moving forward from here. Now you have this blank as well to answer. That is, in a pollen grain, there is presence of one dash cell and one dash cell. Now I hope it is pretty easy for you to answer these two questions, these two blanks basically. Yes. Yes. So in a pollen grain, there is presence of one generative cell and one vegetative cell, where the generative cell is responsible for fusing with the female nuclei after the pollen reaches towards the ovule, while this vegetative nucleus or vegetative cell having vegetative nucleus will be responsible for the germination of pollen tube, or we can say extension of pollen tube from the pollen. Yes, so we'll be moving forward towards the next question, that is the type of relationship between an insect working as a pollinator and a rose flower being pollinated is. What do you think it should be? You know, different type of relationship that works in the nature. There may be symbiotic, and there may be parasitic, there may be competition. So what do you think, which type of relation it is between an insect that is working as a pollinator and a rose flower that is being pollinated? Yes, so this is a symbiotic type of relationship because they both are getting benefit, as the rose flower is being pollinated through that pollinator, or we can say that insect, and that insect is getting towards that flower because it is getting nectar from that flower. So this is being termed as the symbiotic relationship because they both are getting the benefits from each other. So if we move forward, then we'll be looking at this process that we are calling it as pollination basically. So what is the process of pollination? We'll just try to read the statement that is written here. So anything which carries pollen is called as a vector. Yes, so anything which carries pollen is called a vector. So any of the vector, anything, any agency that is carrying the pollen from one flower towards other, we are calling it as vector. And the process through which a pollen is being transferred from anther of one flower to the stigma of same or another flower is termed as pollination. So this process, the whole process of transferring the pollen from one place to the another, or we can say the from the anther of or the male part of the flower towards the stigma, that is the female part of the flower, we are calling it as pollination, because pollen are being transferred, so we are calling it as process of pollination. I hope this whole process, definition of this process is clear to you. We can also see that in the picture that these pollens are taken by this bee and it is being taken towards the stigma of the other flower, that is the female part, where from where it will be going towards this stigma and enter this tube that is being called as style, and will be entering towards the ovary, or we can say the basically the ovule, where the fertilization will take place and the embryo will be formed that will be giving rise to seeds afterwards. Yes, we have this thinking point here, that is what are the different ways by which pollen grains can be transported to another flower. So we from the starting we are discussing about different type of agencies, external agencies that are required for the transfer of pollen from one place to another. So what do you think, what are the different type of agencies which can be involved for the transfer of pollen from one flower to the another, or we can say from the anther to the stigma of the other flower? You can think upon it and you can punch your responses, or we can say you can enter your responses in a chat box. I can look upon them separately afterwards. So to answer a few, we can say wind is there, the water is there. As humans, we also sometimes touch flowers. Pollen can land on our hand or fingertips. We can afterwards touch the other flowers. So in a way, we are also transferring the pollen from the anther towards the stigma. So that is also a agency. We are also acting as an external agency for the transfer of pollen from one flower to the another flower. Rest of them you will be you will be checking, you will be finding out, and you will be stating downwards in the chat box. Yes, so other questions are also there, that is transfer of pollen grains to the stigma. Transfer of pollen grains to the stigma of a pistil is termed as, what it should be termed as, we have just discussed, it should be termed as fertilization, pollination, maturation, or gamete formation. You will be answering in the chat box. And the next question is, anything which carries pollen is termed as dash. So this also, these two questions we have just discussed, you will be answering these two questions in the chat box. So we'll do a quick recap, that we have studied about the structure of flower and how a flower can be unisexual and bisexual in nature. And unisexual flower will be having only a single sexual structure in it, either male or female, and a bisexual flower will be having both the sexual structure in it, that is male sexual structure or male sexual organ, and the female sexual structure, that is pistil and stamens. So male reproductive structure of the flower called pollen grain, we have discussed about it. We have discussed the structure of that pollen grain as well, and we got introduced with the process of transfer of pollens from one flower to the another flower, and we have given a term for that you will be answering, basically what we call that process of transfer from one flower to the another flower when pollen are being transferred. And the question is that flower with both androecium and gynoecium are called dash. So there will be bisexual flower, anther, stamens, or unisexual flower. You will be giving the answers and differentiate between a bisexual and a unisexual flower. So how you will be differentiating between the both. I hope that everything is clear to you, and this lecture was helpful in understanding the concept a bit of pollination. Thank you. We'll be meeting again. Till then, study smart and hard.